What if I told you that everything you've been told about the size of government is a complete lie? That when politicians and media show you charts proving the federal workforce hasn't grown in decades, they're hiding something absolutely massive from you. Something that involves tens of millions of people living off your paycheck right now. Before I expose exactly how big this deception is, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You're watching Monetary Archaeologist, where we dig up the financial truths they're desperately trying to keep buried. Trust me, what I'm about to show you is going to blow your mind, and you won't want to miss the next investigation. All right, let's talk about something you've probably heard 1,000 times. The federal government's workforce hasn't really changed in years. In fact, hasn't it been pretty much the same for decades? That's what they tell you. That's what the charts show. That's what the experts claim. And with all the chaos happening right now, with Trump's administration attempting massive layoffs, you're being told the federal workforce is actually declining, getting smaller, less of a burden on taxpayers. You've probably seen the charts floating around social media. 51,000 federal workers laid off. Sounds like a lot, right? But wait, they say that's only 51,000 out of 3 million total federal employees. Such a small percentage. But here's where things get interesting, and I mean really interesting. Because of the government shutdown drama we've been watching unfold, we're supposedly seeing these massive layoffs happening in real time. Except, here's a fun fact. Judges literally just blocked these layoffs, shut them down completely. Now sure, Trump's administration is trying to push forward with some of them anyway. We'll see how that plays out, especially if this shutdown ends soon, like many people are predicting. But here's what's wild. Despite all of that chaos, despite all of that uncertainty, you'll still see charts being shared everywhere. Charts that show the federal government's workforce is totally normal, not out of proportion at all. Nothing to worry about, citizen. Since the year 2000, we've supposedly only had around 3 million total federal employees. And when you consider how much the population has grown and how much the GDP has exploded, everyone says, look, see, it's fine, it's benign, not a problem whatsoever. But I'm about to show you how that is complete fiction, a misdirection, a magic trick designed to keep you from seeing what's really happening. That 3 million number, it's a joke. It pales in comparison to the number of people who actually work for the government and are funded and supported by your money. Money taken directly from your paycheck. Let me take you back in time a bit. The number of official employees of the federal government hasn't changed much in decades. And I'm not just talking about since the year 2000. This goes back way further. From about 1950 through 1990, the number was increasing, sure, but only from about 2 million to 3 million. That's it. Then from the 1990s until now, the number has fluctuated but stayed pretty steady around that 3 million mark. Now, pause for a second and think about that. How in the world could the federal workforce stay exactly the same size given everything that's happened over the past several decades? Think about all the new agencies, all the new programs, all the new regulations, all the expansion of government power and reach into every aspect of your life. How could all of that happen with the same number of people? It doesn't make sense, does it? And you'd be absolutely right to be suspicious. Here's the answer, and it's simpler than you think. Contractors. The government found a loophole, a way to massively expand while making it look like nothing changed on paper. Let me break down the real numbers for you, and I want you to pay close attention, because this is where it gets shocking. As of 2023, there were 2.1 million people employed by the federal government in civil service roles. That's the number they like to talk about. Then there's over 1 million people employed in the military. About 500,000 people work for the post office. Those numbers are public. Those numbers are acknowledged. But now comes the part they don't want you to focus on. There are 5.2 million people who work for the government as contractors. Let me say that again, 5.2 million contractors. And on top of that, there's an additional 2.3 million people who work for the U.S. government through grants. Now, I already know what you're thinking. I can hear the objections. But wait, those don't count as government employees. Those are contractors. Those are private companies. Let me explain why that argument is complete nonsense. When I make money and I want to pay people to work in my business, I have two options. I can hire them as a W-2 employee, or I can hire them as a 1099 contractor. Yes, there are legal distinctions. There are rules about the type of work they can do, how much they're allowed to work, what kind of control I have over their time and deliverables. There are definitely rules about this, and it's not just a tax thing. But here's the bottom line. At the end of the day, I'm giving somebody money to do work for me. The legal and tax distinctions between a W-2 employee and a 1099 contractor don't matter for the overall point I'm making. The government has way more people working for it than we're led to believe. Now, you might argue, well, these are contractors. These are private individuals, private businesses. The government is just their customer, like any other customer. But let me ask you this. How many of these contractors would exist without the government being their customer? We don't have perfect data on this, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say it's not zero. In fact, I'd bet it's a huge percentage. Think about it logically. Given the size and scope of government growth and the regulatory burden being imposed on our country over the last 100 years, it would have been literally impossible to keep up with this expansion while maintaining the same federal workforce size of just a couple million people. That's exactly why so many have grown through contracts. It's the workaround, the shell game. And here's the key point. To the extent that a private company has the government as its customer, it's not actually a private company. It's just an extension of the government. Let me explain what I mean by that. A real private company goes out into the free market to convince other free individuals to voluntarily pay for a product or service. That's how the free market works. But a government contractor? They get a government contract. That means they know somebody, or they paid somebody, or they navigated some bureaucratic process that gives them the ability to capitalize on taxation. And what is taxation? It's taking money from individuals by force, involuntarily. So the contractor is getting paid with money that was taken from you without your consent, and they're getting it handed to them by government officials. Is it an exchange for a product or service? Yes, sometimes. But it's involuntary money, which means that people wouldn't have chosen to pay for it otherwise. Therefore, by definition, it is part of the government, not a private free market company. Now, I understand this is a spectrum. There are lots of companies who participate in both the free market and have the government as one of their customers. I get that. But to the extent that the government is the customer of a contractor, that portion of their business is not free market. It is just an extension of the government. Now let's talk about those 2.3 million people employed by the government through grants. This is just another extension of the U.S. government, handing money to people to tell them to do things. I'm not even debating here whether any of these grants are necessary or good or bad. I'm just pointing out that they exist, and they count. If you get your paycheck because the government handed someone money and that money flows to you, you work for the government, period. Doesn't matter what research you're doing, doesn't matter what university you work for, doesn't matter what studies you're participating in. If the government is funding your paycheck, you should be counted as a government employee. So when you add all these categories up, as of 2023, the full federal workforce was a staggering 11.3 million people. Let that sink in for a moment. Not 3 million, 11.3 million. Far larger than the 3 million that everybody always talks about. Far larger than what the charts show. Far larger than what politicians admit to. They get their growth through outside work, through contractors and grants, which is still the government, just hidden, just off the books in terms of how they present it to you. And now there are 11.3 million of them being funded and supported by taking money directly from your paycheck. Let me break down how this actually works, because it's important you understand the mechanics. You work in the free market. You produce a good or a service that is greater than the value of what you are being paid. That's why the voluntary exchange happens. Your work is worth more to your employer than the money they're giving up to keep you employed. And to you, your labor and time is worth less than the amount you're getting in return for the paycheck. Otherwise, you would go somewhere else. That's a voluntary arrangement. Both parties benefit. But the government steps in and takes some of that from you by force. You have no choice in the matter, not on the amount, not on where it goes. And they hand that money out to 11.3 million people who are not producing a good or service that somebody else is voluntarily asking for. Now, 11.3 million is already an insane number, but it still doesn't scratch the surface. Why? Because we're just talking about federal employees here. There are other things called states and cities and counties. They also have government employees, lots of them. When you look at state employees and local government employees, you have to add over 20 million more people to this total. 5.5 million people work for state governments around the country. 15 million people work for local governments. Now, I'll be the first to admit I would far rather have more emphasis on local government than on federal government. The more local you are, the more skin in the game there is. People often live in or near the places they're ruling over, so they have to deal with the consequences more directly. They're often more aware of the problems that local communities are facing, and they can have greater authority over changing things that people in those communities actually care about. In fact, I think the entire structure of both size and power should be completely flipped. Cities should have much more power than state governments, and state governments should have much more power than the federal government. That's the way the Constitution originally designed it. It was supposed to be a bottom-up government, not top-down. But that's not the world we live in today. We live in a top-down government where the federal government has most of the power. And yet, despite that, local governments have absolutely exploded over the past 75 years. State governments have actually done the best at controlling their size. And I know that on the charts it looks like state government employment is above the federal workforce. But remember that federal workforce number doesn't count the contractors. The true federal workforce size is around 11 million. So if we adjusted the chart properly, we'd have to place the 11 million for the federal government way higher. Despite the fact that we don't have a bottom-up government anymore, local governments actually employ more people than the federal government does. And here's something critical you need to understand. Every single person who receives their paycheck as a result of the government handing the money is a person who, financially and definitionally speaking, is not contributing to the economy. They are receiving something somebody else has produced. Now, before you get upset, I'm not saying some of these jobs aren't necessary or beneficial or good. You can absolutely make that argument for certain positions. But what I am saying is this. It is the free market, the pure private sector, that actually produces the money and the capital and the wealth and the goods and the services. From that pool that is being produced, governments take a large percentage when you consider local, state, and federal taxes combined. And they use that money to pay anybody who works for them to do a job that the private sector is not doing. And here's what people don't understand about the private sector. The private sector operates out of self-interest, out of profit motive, out of greed if you want to use that word. When I engage in business, when I sell somebody a product or service, when I give my time to somebody for a paycheck, the transaction that's happening is one where money is changing hands voluntarily. If I'm going to get a job somewhere and one person will pay me $30 an hour, but another person will pay me $40 an hour for the same job, I'm going to take the $40 an hour job. All else being equal. Obviously, there are other factors. But if they're equal, I'll take the higher paying option. This is just how business works. If I can sell a product for $100 and sell 1,000 of them, or I could sell 1,000 of the exact same product for $150, I'm going to sell it for $150. which means if a product or a service is not being taken care of by the free market, it's because all potential free market actors have looked at that opportunity and decided that it is not worth the cost, not worth the risk, not worth the investment. Let me give you a perfect example of this. Let's say I'm a sports team, a private company, and I want a new stadium. I run the numbers and do the math on what my return on that investment will be. And I might think, you know what, this is not going to be a great investment. I'm going to have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and the return I'm going to get might be negative, or at best, really low. Either way, it's just not worth it for me. So what do I do as a sports team? I go to the local government and I say, hey, you should involuntarily take money from other people to build this stadium for us. And don't worry, there's going to be lots of extra business activity from the sports games and everything happening there. You can run events there. It'll be a great investment for your city. I pay off the right people. I know the right people in power. I make the right promises. So the city decides, yep, we are going to build this stadium. In a situation where the free market decided the return on investment wouldn't be worth it, somebody with a monopoly on violence, who can use force to take money from people, decides to do it anyway. This is why everything the government does, fundamentally speaking, is a drain on resources. It is a net destruction of wealth. Again, I have to keep saying this. Just because it is a cost, just because it is a net drain on wealth, I am not making the argument that it all shouldn't happen. You can make a compelling case that there are many government jobs that are necessary or beneficial, but you cannot mathematically state that it is not a drain on wealth because it is only funded by taking from what somebody else has produced. Now, I know you've probably already started doing the math in your head. When you add up the entire government workforce, the number is absolutely staggering. The official data shows over 23 million full-time employees of local, state, and federal governments as of 2025. It's important to note this dataset does not include military. It does not include the CIA, the NSA, the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, or the Defense Intelligence Agency. We know the military is a little over 1 million people, so we can immediately add 1 million to this number. Now we're at 24.5 million. Postal workers were included in that count. Contractors were not, so we can add another 5.2 million. Grant workers are another 2.3 million, which brings our total to over 32 million people. And we know that number is actually conservative because some of this data comes from 2023 and parts of the government have expanded since then. Let me put in perspective just how many 32 million people really is. The current population of the United States is about 334 million people, which means 10% of the entire U.S. population, citizens plus non-citizens included, works for the government. For every 10 people, there's one person who gets a paycheck by taking money from the other 9. But guess what? All 334 million people in the United States don't work. In fact, the majority of people in the United States do not have jobs. This makes sense, right? There are kids, there are stay-at-home moms, some stay-at-home dads, there are retired people who live off their own savings and investments. There are retired people who also live off money from other working people, but that's a whole other topic we don't have time to get into today. Of the 334 million people in America, how many people do you think actually have jobs? Now, I'm not talking about how many jobs exist in the United States because that's a deceiving number. One person might have 2 or 3 jobs. If you work at Taco Bell and McDonald's and Burger King all part-time, that's counted as 3 jobs, but it's still just one person. So how many actual people have jobs? Any job whatsoever? According to the Federal Reserve, that number is about 163 million, and that includes a 16-year-old who just got their first part-time job sweeping floors at a movie theater. It includes a single mom working a couple of jobs to put food on the table for her kids at home. So let's do the math together. Out of every 10 people in the United States, 5 of them are actively working, making money, doing jobs. But one of those 5 works for the government, which means they're getting paid by the other 4 people who are actually producing in the private sector. Because 10% of the population works for the government and half the population works in total, that means for every 10 people, only 4 people are actually producing. 4 people producing in the free market. One person who looks like they have a job because they clock in and clock out every day and attend meetings and follow procedures, but they're only getting paid by money being taken away from the 4 who produce. And those 4 producers are also taking care of the other 5 people who can't work or don't work: the kids, the elderly, the disabled, the retired. Which means approximately 40% of the entire population is producing to actually take care of everybody else. So the next time you hear somebody say that we need to raise taxes, that the government is going broke or running a deficit because we're not taxing people enough, I want you to remember this. How about the first thing we do is stop taking so much away from the minority of people who are actually producing? The people who are actually making the money, making the goods, making the services that support literally everybody. And that one person in every 10 who is living in a position of power, living off the 4 people producing, maybe we should have fewer of them. Maybe they should be forced to come up with a skill, to sell a product or a service that people in the real world would actually want and would voluntarily pay for. 10% of the entire U.S. population being employed by government, 20% of all job holders working for government. Maybe it's time we look at that and say, you know what? That number's a little too high. Maybe we should try going in the other direction for a while. Because here's the thing that really puts it all in perspective. Even if all of them were to get laid off and none of them could find a job and they all went on welfare, the 4 people working would still be paying for them and supporting them. So nothing would really change in terms of the economic burden, except for one massive difference. Our lives would get easier. We wouldn't have so many people regulating us, breathing down our backs, telling us what we can and cannot do with our own property, with our own businesses, with our own lives. Even in that worst-case scenario, life would actually be easier for the productive members of society. So there you have it, the federal workforce myth completely destroyed. It's not 3 million, it's not even 11 million when you count contractors and grants, it's 32 million across all levels of government. 1 in 10 Americans, 20% of all workers, all funded by the minority of people actually producing value in the free market. If you found this information valuable, if this opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, send this video to somebody you think would appreciate it. Or just keep it in your back pocket, because the holidays are coming up and you might need some good conversation starters for those family dinners. This is Monetary Archaeologist, digging up the truths they want to keep buried. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation.